I'm Mike Foley. I'm a professor of journalism here at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. And I'd like to take you back in time today for a bit of history, a history lesson about how laws were changed and how a struggling group of people struck out for freedom of the press at the University of Florida. And beyond, back to the 1970s, there were fewer than half the students at that time. The parking was fairly easy to find, and Stephen O'Connell wasn't a Jim. It was the president of the university. Winn-Dixie had extra large eggs on sale for 58 cents a dozen, 4 loaves of bread for 88 cents. At Publix, you get a 9-piece bucket of chicken for $1.89. In any event, joining me here today are 3 principals of this story. Ron Sachs, who is now the president of the Sachs Media Group, and at the time was editor of the then Florida Alligator, no independent at that time.
Not yet.
In the middle on our panel today is Jean Chance, the professor emeritus of the College of Journalism and Communications. She is now the chairman of the board of Campus Publications, retired as a professor. And Chuck Chance, who is a retired circuit judge, who still does some mediation and arbitration work and teaches from time to time at the UF Law School. Welcome, panel. We're going to start today by remembering back to maybe what was the impetus for this drastic change. When did this whole thing about abortion laws come to your attention, Ron?
Well, in the fall of 1971 is when I began as editor of the Alligator. And at the time, we were in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. All this was pretty fresh, and all that is tumult on campus. Against that backdrop, at least once a week in the Alligator, we tried to do an in-depth takeout, if you will, on some burning issue. So the particular week in question, it was about abortion law in Florida, which dated back to 1868. Abortions were illegal, only allowed in very rare circumstances. And at the same time, the legislature passed that law. It passed a law that prohibited disseminating any information about where someone could get an abortion. We did not know about the latter law when we began to put together a couple of stories about women who had had abortions, legal and illegal, on the campus, and wanted to publish a list of counseling services. One of them was a Catholic entity, which was not actually going to be commending women to abortions, but technically we learned seeking to publish that list actually would violate Florida law. And it was an Alligator staffer, a columnist, John Parker, who was in law school, who presented us with this epiphany that if we went ahead with publication, we'd be committing a felony.
Okay, and was this topic brought up by a specific case, or is it just an idea session and you thought this would be a good current event?
It was an issue in the country, and certainly Florida may not have been the place where things began, but it seemed a reasonable issue to take a look at the laws, comparative laws in Florida compared to other states. And there were women, co-eds here at the campus, who found themselves in an unwanted pregnancy, and really were in quite of a pickle, to clean it up for you, of what to do about it. So we thought this was a pretty good in-depth story. We interviewed some co-eds, and once we had the stories put together, the sidebar, the list, if you will, is what would have violated the law. And because the Alligator was published on campus with a portion of students' activities fees.
Part of the College of Journalism.
That's right. It was considered a campus organ. I don't think it was part of the College of Journalism.
It wasn't part of the college.
It wasn't. It was under Campus Communications, which did the yearbook, the literary magazine, and the Alligator, which really had a daily presence in students' lives. At the time, hard to imagine it today, there wasn't a robust news offering here locally. Gainesville Sun, most students couldn't afford to buy it. You had the Alligator, which was given out free, and you had an AM rock and roll radio station, WGGG. These were the sources of information for students, with the Alligator taking that responsibility pretty seriously.
And the circulation of the Alligator at the time?
Every student had a paper available to them, so probably about 20,000, yes.
Pretty good. And Jean, what were you at this time?
I was a very, very early to the faculty, I guess tenure line, beginning faculty member. This was not my student.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well,
Bad for me.
It probably was good for me, but I'm never sure that the administration, including the college administration, or at that time it was a school, This
Yes.
was not a college.
And this building really didn't exist.
That's right. We were in the west wall of the stadium, which was not necessarily attractive, but you dealt with it. My first recollection of this as an issue was what I read in the Alligator. Ron, many of the staffers were not my students. But we have sort of a traditional friend of the Alligator sort of core group on the faculty that are kind of ad hoc by telephone usually advisors. When they have a question, they always know they can call us, which is sometimes bad because their hours are usually different from normal human beings. And the calls would come at very, very late or early hours. But there has always been a respect for the independence, whether it was at the time independent of the university, which it truly was not because it took money from student activity fees. But there was a relationship. Some of the professors in the course that you teach, for example, the reporting course, Buddy Davis would have lab stories and the outside assignment stories as a matter of routine. Copies of the
The
good
first story I
story
wrote for my reporting class with Buddy
Right.
was published in the Alligator.
would be sent to the Alligator. Good training for
That
the
was the only one,
students.
I must say.
It made the students feel the responsibility of publication. It's good for the Alligator because it gives them some copy to sometimes fill big news holes. So that was the relationship. Informal as it was a very important one.
Right.
Yeah, well,
And
I'm sorry.
and you at the time were?
Well, I had started practicing law here as a part-time assistant public defender, and I quit from that job. And at the time, I was doing some criminal defense work and some litigation involving the construction industry, architects and builders who were being sued or suing other people. And I think about half my practice was paid criminal defense work, and the other half was paid contractor and architect litigation.
Okay. So, we're at the point where you want to publish this abortion story and you want to publish a sidebar, what you would think would be an innocuous sidebar, just listing the places where people could get information about abortion. And you found out that it was probably against the law, but
Well, John Parker, a law student who wrote a column for us, very popular on the op-ed page called Fluted Columns, comes up to me and says, "Yeah, Ronnie, if you publish this list, you're committing a felony." And I said, "Oh, BS, John." And then, of course, he broke out a law book like from his back pocket and showed us the statute. And at the same time, Alan Whiteleather, who was the faculty advisor to the paper, I think the university kind of insisted we have one. He didn't really assert himself much day to day. And by the way, neither did the university, though we did receive a portion of student activities fees. We never really felt the university's presence. It did not interfere to its credit. I think they were monitoring through the faculty advisor, but we never really felt that. So once Alan Whiteleather became aware of this potential felony, he did assert himself, and he said, "Well, I can't allow you to publish that." And that triggered a process that's under the umbrella of the so-called Board of Student Publications, which was the structure under which the Alligator, the literary magazine, and the yearbook all were governed. And we submitted to that process of a decision by the board whether
you
we
asked
could...
them whether you could publish this list.
Yeah, we did. We went in front of them, and as I recall, it was kind of an evenly balanced board. Jack Detweiler, a great journalism prof, was the chairman of it, but he only voted in the case of a tie, I believe, the chair. And it was evenly structured with either three or four.
Five.
All right, but there was 2 students and 2 faculty. And so, during this controversy, I kind of ceded control over how we covered our own controversy to Gary Grunder, the then managing editor. It seemed wrong to me to be directing the coverage of my own potential felony. We basically submitted to the process. I remember going in there to interview and make our case, and then someone made the case on why we shouldn't publish it. And then I left the room, and they voted. And I think one faculty member was absent from the key vote, and we prevailed. Even the Tri-Delt on the Board of Student Publications voted for publication. And so we were kind of celebrating this victory and kind of put it out there to publish it, and then early in the morning I get a call from the guy in Ocala who was our printer saying he would not print the list because he read the story,
Because he would be in violation of the law.
thought he would be culpable, and so he allowed me to dictate some copy, and probably had the most creative use of white space ever in Alligator history.
But you had nothing where this was
Nothing except
supposed to
a little
go.
copy black about why this space is blank. And President O'Connell contacted me, came over to the Rights Union to buy me a Coke, and sat down and said to me that he was going to overrule the Board of Student Publications and prohibit the
This is
publication.
before the paper went to press?
That's correct. Well, actually, it was after the printer refused to print it. He just told me, stop this. I forbid you from doing it. I'm technically the publisher. This was all news to me. At the time I became editor, nobody said, hey, he's your publisher.
Right.
And so that begat a process where we had to determine what we were going to do.
Now, were you involved at all at this point, Gene?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Professor Chance was never a faculty member I had the good fortune to be in the class of, but I sought out her advice and counsel often when I worked at the Alligator. And I asked her if we could meet and talk about this issue at her house with her husband, who was going to be my attorney if I got in trouble. And we gathered at the Chance home with some students and them. And again, I think it was somewhat courageous for Jean Chance because she was putting skin in the game to even allow us to meet at her
But
house.
she did not have tenure,
That's
No, she
right.
did not.
so there was no job security here at all.
No, I absolutely. What I remember is it was class change time, and that was really exciting over and because the hallways are pretty narrow in the west wall of the stadium. They're narrow anyway. And when there are kids going this way and this way, and I think I was on the stairway between classes, and this 20-year-old kid comes out, Professor Chance, could I speak to you a minute? And I said, I'm not even sure at that point that I had an office. There was a time, I'm not kidding you.
Unbelievable.
There was a time where, it could have been in 1971, where I was still not fully on the faculty, and I had a cardboard box that Buddy Davis let me keep in his window ledge. He was in the good side of the stadium, where if you were on the good side, you had windows, so you would have a ledge. When I finally became a faculty member, I was up on the 4th floor in the bad side, where the ceilings, because they were
Slanted.
following where the seats go, and also things crawled up on the top like feral cats and pigeons. So, but I'm not sure that I was even in that office at the time. But if I was, I know I wouldn't really have wanted him to come and visit there because it was not that pleasant. But I said, well, what is this about? I knew who he was, but I knew he wasn't one of my students. And he said, well, it's about, and he's explaining. And I said, oh, I think this is going to take a little more time than. So I still don't know how these kids all end up in the living room at my house. I just think I got a phone call.
Everybody has a different opinion of that I remember that it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I hear some cars in the driveway, but I don't know exactly what's going on, and I'm still asleep, and there's people that come into the house, and I'm still not sure what this is about, but I'm not getting up because the house wasn't on fire or anything like that, so I don't know. So Jean comes upstairs and she says, get up, get up. And I said, why? And she says, come down here. Ronnie Sachs is about to commit a felony and you've got to talk to him.
Great wake-up call.
And I said, oh, great.
Well, my recall's a little bit different.
All right, see, there we go.
I don't believe it was.
It was 40 years
I don't
ago.
believe it was the dead of night. I believe we were there in the early evening,
You were.
and it was by
went to bed early.
it was by pressured invitation. I needed to talk to some smart people, and so what's interesting is who was there were these two fine folks, Gene and Chuck Chance, and Steve Uhlfelder, who was a law student who had been president of the university student body the year before. and Don Middlebrooks, now a terrific federal judge in Miami, who was the current student body president. And we gathered with a couple other Alligator staffers at the Chance home at a reasonable hour, in the family hour, if you will. And, and we discussed what was at stake here if we went ahead with publication in some way. And Chuck pointed out what the legal issues were, what the legal risk was, what the risk was for me with the potential jail time, a year in prison, I think is what could happen. And at the
Expulsion from the university.
well, that, yeah. At the end of a robust discussion, I kind of asked everybody to go around the room and give me a go or no go. I don't remember if it was to a person, but I believe to a person, out of their concern for me, they suggested not to do it. I don't think they really believed that when they said it, but I think they were telling me what they thought was the right thing for my well-being.
I believed it.
I believed it.
This is a 100-year-old, more than 100-year-old law.
103 years, because this was
Banning abortion
October.
and banning giving out any information.
October in
about it.
1971 is when this is happening. And I listened to everybody's terrific insights and suggestions not to do it. And it'd be interesting to hear Chuck's perspective, because he meant it when he said don't do it. And then I politely asked everybody to please help me figure out what to do, because we were going to go ahead and do it. And
What was that decision born of? Was this a journalistic zeal, or were you just
yeah,
angry to throw a bomb
it was
at somebody?
a journalistic zeal. We wanted to publish this information before we ever knew it constituted a 103-year-old felony. So nothing about that changed just because we learned it was against the law, a law that, though I was only 21 years old, I believed what I was learning at the College of Journalism, that Congress and the states shall pass no law to abridge the freedom of the press or religion. And if it's going to be real, and it comes across your life, even as a college student who's got the privilege of being editor of the Alligator, and you ignore that, then why are you even going into journalism? So we wanted to publish it, and nothing about that changed. The law seemed to me, as a non-jurist, to be unconstitutional, and so we decided to plow ahead anyway, and at some risk, but it didn't seem as risky as not doing it because the principle involved.
And Chuck, your warning was?
Don't do it. That only 21-year-olds would do this. That this is a felony. That it's also, I know that the Alligator was in play in some way. What the president, he's a student. He's got the president of the university that is going to be mad at him. He's got the state attorney who I know is going to prosecute him for a felony. A good example of this, although there's good zeal on the part of the First Amendment, Ron Sachs, and the Florida Alligator, you didn't see anybody at the Miami Herald publishing this and facing a felony.
Yeah.
You didn't see anybody at the Atlanta Constitution publishing this. You didn't see anybody at the St. Pete Times. In fact, later on, there was a small article in the New York Times about this, and and they didn't add to the list what was being published. So.
Everybody was afraid of this law.
So, well,
They all thought it was unconstitutional, but they were afraid of it.
well, I do mediation, and I say, if you have a locks-on case, you got an 80% chance of winning. So there's all this uncertainty about what judge gets this case, what appellate court gets this case, what justice of the United States Supreme Court might write on this this case. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and here's a young student with his whole career ahead of him and facing felony charges. I didn't think it was a good call. And by the way, Ron, it may have started early, but I know
It did go late. It did.
I know that we talked about you calling Stephen O'Connell and telling you were doing it, and
right.
that was at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yes. I
remember
So I think it started later.
No wonder he's mad at you.
Young people, I notice now that young people go out at 11 o'clock. So it may seemed early to these kids, but it was late to me. But anyway, there was a lot at stake,
Right.
a lot of unknowns, and Ronnie, sort of like family, and it's like your son saying, I'm going to commit a felony, but the law's no good.
Right.
So I was very hesitant. Any lawyer would, there's no lawyer in this country that would have told Ronnie to go ahead and do that. Once he did it, then we're in a new
Go into a different mode.
circumstance. But it would not have been an adult decision. But that's what's good about young people, and that's why I still do the law student, that you take young people that are willing to take a risk sometimes because they're 21 and not worried about their family and children and their job and all that.
10 feet tall and bulletproof, yes. So, Professor Chance, how did the faculty figure into all this?
Well, the faculty was, I would say, divided. Probably tilted more toward being against rather than in support of. You mentioned Jack Delweiler, and Jack was on the board, and
He was a professor of...
he was at that time journalism department, and then they divided up, and he became a public relations faculty member. But at the time, he was on the journalism faculty. Probably the younger faculty were more sympathetic with the Alligator's position. I know Ron's talked to Buddy Davis, who at the time was a senior member of the journalism faculty. I'm not sure that he had won the Pulitzer Prize yet, but was a very distinguished, respected faculty member. And there just was not a lot of support. And my position was, here are these things, basic principles of responsible journalism that we teach out of the textbooks and we preach about in our lectures, and I just could not see how this was not a First Amendment clear-cut case. I was not as supportive personally in the area of abortion. And I think a lot of people on the faculty had accused me of just being rabid feminist. This was when you talked about women's lib in a very derogatory way. And at the time, our daughter was probably about a year old, having just gone through her infancy. I really had mixed feelings about how I felt the students looked at abortion. Was different than the way I saw it, and that was just a generational issue. But as far as I was concerned, I thought the faculty, my colleagues certainly in the journalism department, I just felt they should see this as a clear-cut First Amendment case, and that was really the foundation for my solid support.
So, armed with the support of one Chance member and the advice not to publish of another Chance member, you decided to publish, and you made this phone call at 2 a.m. to the president of the
I did,
university.
and I had never called him before at home or after. Clearly not after.
Especially after.
And I thought that, I was learning at the College of Journalism, news is news when it happens. So that we had just reached the decision, I had made the decision, and then was seeking advice. I did call President O'Connell from the laundry room at the Chance house on a Princess phone or something, and I don't think it was a portable phone. It was certainly wired, and I woke him up. It was closer to 2 a.m. than 10 p.m., and I apologized for the hour of the call, and I said I wanted to tell you that I'm going to respectively disobey your prohibition on publishing this information. And I said goodnight. And I met with the Alligator staff and told them it's not a democracy, but I wanted them to have a vote in this. This is what we're preparing to do. If you say no, I'll rethink it. And we had a unanimous vote. Don Middlebrooks, the student body president, because we had the problem getting the list published by our publisher, allowed me, I asked him if we could make up the list on a single sheet and mimeograph it on the
Mimeograph.
student government
How quaint.
mimeograph machine. So frankly, it was a piece of state property, the student government-owned mimeograph machine, that actually committed the felony by printing 22,000 copies of the list. And I think after talking with Chuck, I signed the list to try and limit the vulnerability of the Alligator to me being the criminal, not the newspaper. I did it not out of ego, but out of taking responsibility. That was my decision, and I didn't want the paper or any of the other staff punished for my act. And then my favorite part of the story about the crime itself was dividing up the 22,000 copies of the Mimeo sheets, and kids in their little knapsack book bags, whatever you want to call them today, skulked around the campus waiting for the delivery of the paper. And when it arrived, one sheet was inserted into each newspaper, and the deed was done. Later that morning, Chuck called me and told me that there was an information, I think is the right art form of the legal phrase, from my arrest from the state attorney's office, and that there could be a big show of them coming down to arrest me at the Alligator office at the Union, or I could turn myself in, which seemed to be the better way to go, to not have that big disruption at the office. So I went to his law office, and then he escorted me on the veritable perp walk. It was the only time I was on the other side of the cameras, and it was not comfortable to do that, to go get arrested and fingerprinted, mugshot, and briefly have a visit to jail.
How did you get involved at this point? From this publication, the dissemination of these flyers, when did you hear?
Well, and we knew the night that we were discussing it, Ronnie was going to get arrested. So
Did you volunteer, or were you volunteered?
well, no, I didn't want him to go to prison, but
I think Gene talked him into it.
no, it's fine. It was lawyers like challenges, and although lawyers don't like to represent people that they know and like that have committed a felony, it's not the best thing to do. The fact of the matter is that I agreed to represent him, and I did call Professor Fletcher Baldwin, who's the constitutional law professor, was the constitutional law professor at the University Law School, and asked Fletcher if he would assist in the representation, and he immediately agreed. So not only did I have local knowledge, so to speak, but I had one of the most highly trained constitutional lawyers in the state to help with the legal issues. So I felt we were we're not happy about Roddy doing this,
Right.
but we're as in good a place as we could be legally with the help of Professor Baldwin.
So how did you feel? You went and turned yourself in?
Turned myself in.
Were you scared? Were you nervous?
It was
Or were you
uncomfortable.
21 and didn't care?
I was not. I cared. It was not like I was having a good time. I took responsibility, but walking in front of media, why'd you do it and all that hoo-ha. I didn't particularly enjoy that. I stayed sensitive ever since that to when I was a reporter interviewing people about the uncomfortableness of being the subject. But went into the jail, which we had investigated the year before at the Alligator,
Right.
and the very warden, D.L. Peterson, who was critical in our investigation of a jailhouse murder that was called suicide, joked, I knew we'd get you in here sometime. I was mugshot, fingerprinted, and Chuck arranged for my release on my own recognizance as a low flight risk since I'd lived here for 4 years. And I think word came to his office from President O'Connell's office that he wanted me to come right to Tigard Hall to a news conference. And I was obedient and went there, and that was much more uncomfortable than the perp walk, because in front of the cameras he used me as a human prop, essentially. Sure. I remember wearing a short sleeve Alligator Lacoste shirt, and my hair was a lot longer, and he put his arm around me and squeezed my shoulder and said, I told Ronnie not to do this, and he did it anyway. And essentially he said that if I were found guilty of the felony charge, I would be fired as editor and expelled from the university. And then he went into what I took as double jeopardy. He said he was also, since I disobeyed him, and he was technically publisher of the paper, asking the Attorney General of Florida's office for an advisory opinion about whether he, as president/publisher, could exercise prior restraint over the campus newspaper. And he said the answer to that query, if it were in the affirmative that he could have exercised prior restraint, that he was going to fire me and suspend me, is what I recall. So I didn't really get to say anything at the news conference. I was really just there to be a ploy for him. And so was set in motion both the AG's action and the trial that came a couple months later.
And in the meantime, what were you doing? Preparing for trial? Preparing for work?
Yeah, we're preparing the legal arguments for, we had moved to dismiss the information filed by the state attorney's office as violating the Constitution, and we had a couple-hour hearing, I guess, before then Circuit Judge Tench, and he considered briefs and arguments.
And this is before the opinion from the Attorney General?
Yes, I came down before the trial, though.
Okay. And in the meantime, the journalism school was?
Just kind of buzzing along, and you know, it just seemed to me so ironic. And I think Buddy Davis really saw this not as a First Amendment question. He wrote editorials in the Gainesville Sun that were just scathing about the Alligator. And I know one of his strong...
Against the Alligator?
Against the
Alligator.
I think probably some of his strongest arguments against the paper was, you know, here you are taking all this money from the state, from the taxpayers. You want it both ways. And, you know, Buddy was one of my professors in undergrad school, and now he was my colleague. We had many discussions about why he felt this way, and I didn't change his mind, and he didn't change my mind. And I think he saw this as just a young whippersnapper on the faculty who hasn't thought this out well. And I thought he was an old timer who I was stunned that he really did not see. I think he did see abortion as a strong undercurrent. Mm-hmm. But I know that the conversations that Ron had with him, it was this evolution that was becoming a volcano.
So now we're preparing for trial, and what was the next thing that happened?
Well, I do want to speak to this. I had Buddy Davis as a professor every year of my 4 years at UF. As a freshman, making an A in his editorial writing class was probably my academic high point at the College of Journalism. And I went to him to seek his counsel because I respected him and I cared about him and I loved him. And he acknowledged to me the law was ripe for overturning, it was unconstitutional, but he never once said to me, but I advise you not to do it. Frankly, he would have had a greater influence on me than the team of people I met with at the Chance House. It's just the truth, because I believed in him so much. So when he gut punched me with the cheap shot editorial that said this was all about the editor being on an unaborted ego trip, I think it hurt me as much as anything ever hurt me in my life from a mentor. And I think it was wrong because it wasn't an abortion issue. We got protest letters from women's groups that,
and you were called names.
That this wasn't about abortion. Ron Sachs is doing this for the First Amendment. Well, hell yeah. If we couldn't do this under the First Amendment, then women couldn't have the right to get the information about what to do if they were in this family way. So got a lot of hate mail. My parents, during this interim period while the case is being prepared, my job was to just keep being editor and go to school, but Chuck and Fletcher Baldwin had the tough job. But my parents were getting horrible hate mail at home, threatening letters and such.
You were the baby-faced baby killer.
That was one of the that was one of the letters. Someone scrawled in the border of one of the newspaper articles. I think I found those kind of amusing that people could be that whacked out about something. But I do think it's important to note that we never took it on because it was an abortion issue at the Alligator. We took it on because it was a First Amendment issue, and if we did not have this right. Also, if it had been put to a student vote whether a portion of their activity fee should go to the Alligator, we would have had a probably 90% yes vote on that back in those days. So while it was taxpayer money, we felt pretty comfortable that we were doing the right thing, even as a student publication owned by the university.
Back to my question, what was the next major step in this?
The next major step was the opinion came down from the Attorney General's office, and here in a legal quarter that was President O'Connell's strong suit as a former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, he got smacked down. And while it wasn't a binding opinion, the Attorney General of the state of Florida said, no, you can't exercise prior restraint on the newspaper. You can hold the editor and the newspaper subsequently accountable for what they do. And I believe it was that, forget the felony charge, that decision is what triggered in the president a plan to get the Alligator off campus. And while some think he gave it a life of independence, those of us who worked there were pretty sure he was trying to kill it.
Did this opinion have any legal bearing on this case?
No, not so much that we argue, Professor Baldwin and I argued a kind of a separate point than the Attorney General. The Attorney General's opinion was more on the authority of the president of the university, as I recall, to be publisher and to be direct the Alligator.
So then you went to trial.
Yeah,
Well,
I will say Sigma Delta Chi, the Society of Professional Journalists
Yeah.
here, but particularly in some of the urban markets in Florida. This is when Florida's daily newspapers kind of rose up to the occasion and took an interest in the case. And while I don't think it would have paid for a couple hours of Chuck Chance and Fletcher Baldwin's time, I think Ron Sachs Defense Fund generated about $500 in token support for the legal
Quite
defense.
a princely sum in those
Yes.
days.
Yeah,
It paid just about the Xeroxing.
But pretty much we went to trial in early December of 1971, and I think what happened was stunning to the press covering it. To me, I really had no idea. I knew I had great legal representation, but I was fairly confident from the first time John Parker said this violates the law that it was a bad law. And while I had no legal training to know that, I had my journalism training, and I thought we were on pretty firm ground. But it was up to Chuck and Fletcher to prove it in court.
And your tactics were?
Well, just to argue the First Amendment freedoms issue. I'm glad that Ron was more confident in what the law really was than Fletcher and I were, but your clients are always more optimistic than the lawyer.
And was this a jury trial or just a judge?
No,
decision?
It's judges, and I'll tell you, when the judge, hit his gavel and declared Florida Statute 797.02, which was the abortion information statute, passed in 1868, and 103 years later, Judge Ben Montench, the father of one of the founding members of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers,
I knew you were going to work
declared it unconstitutional. I felt such relief because I felt vindicated that we had done the right thing. I had nothing to do with the coverage of it, which went way beyond the Alligator in Gainesville. But then Chuck and Fletcher came over to the defendant's table and leaned in and said, listen, while we're here, we think we have a pretty good case about the root abortion statute from 1868. And they asked me, is it all right with you if we take a shot at that?
Since you were paying the bill?
Well, I said, you're batting 1,000, go ahead. And I think that was stunning upon stunning. What happened
What
next?
happened?
We didn't get, I don't think we were particularly successful on that point.
Actually, you were.
Okay.
I think you want to re-rack that, because
All right.
what I want to help
Okay,
Chuck
help me
with
with
is
that.
that Judge Tench struck down the root abortion law from 1868. Technically, I remember that was part of the story the next day. Gainesville, Alachua County were the only place where the state abortion law was no longer in effect. And the legislature had to rewrite the law and, which I wouldn't say liberalize it, but modern it up. But I would say you did win, sir.
Okay. Did not remember that.
Yeah.
I was so glad he wasn't going to prison.
Yeah.
And afterwards?
Well, afterwards, I don't think we had a particular party. I think it was a huge relief to stand up for the First Amendment while still in college and to prevail. I mean, I'm tearing up here recalling what I felt. I never really felt in jeopardy of going to prison, partly because of my just huge faith in Chuck and Fletcher Baldwin. But I knew we were right, and all the people I talked to at the Alligator felt the same thing. And I never really felt at risk to go to prison, though it could have happened. I think it was an anchor moment in my life because we did it for all the right reasons. And if we had to do it again today, the only thing that would cause me hesitation is if I knew making the decision that I would have put the Alligator in great jeopardy, which I didn't really think about that much because I felt sure we would prevail. I might have stutter-stepped a little bit before the decision.
In terms of saying Ronnie was going to prison, he's right. He probably would not have. But our main concern was that because of the dynamics of the thing, because of the president of the university, because of our then state attorney, I had every reason to believe that if he was convicted, they would adjudicate him to be a felon, which would have he would have been a convicted felon for the rest of his life, and that has all kinds of
Sure.
and that was my principal concern. I could kid him about going to prison. I don't think that would have happened, but I have probably reason to believe that they would not have withheld adjudication because of this, because it was an intentional, knowing kind of violation of the law, that they would have adjudicated him to be a felon, and that was I think probably a greater concern by me and Fletcher Baldwin than 21-year-old Ron Sachs. But anyway, we were really concerned about that.
I have a question, because at that point, somebody, maybe it was just in your head, but what caused you to go to the sheriff's office, to the jail, and ask for your fingerprints back?
I actually think Chuck might have counseled me that I could get my arrest quashed, or whatever the legal phrase is, so that it wouldn't hurt me. But I think Chuck's right. If I had not gone to prison, but had been convicted, it would have affected my career, my life. I would always have to report on an employment form. Not only was I arrested, I was convicted, but it really didn't come into mind. I really am comforted at the time and all the years since that we believed in the First Amendment. We had an opportunity to stand up for it. And what's interesting to me is we wanted to print this information before we knew it was against a bad law. Once we knew there was a bad law, we figured, well, the second benefit is let's go after this bad law. It wasn't the reason we printed it. We weren't going to let the bad law get in the way of us doing our job. It was not a sandbox. It wasn't a playground. We considered it a real newspaper. And I think real newspapers came to our defense of what we did at the time. So I feel pretty good about what we did. And I think that the chances were courageous in helping me, because Jean had more risk than I did, probably, professionally, because she was in a job and was actually counseling me. And if that had been known, and it was known, it could have cost her in many more ways than it could have cost me.
And so this then was the beginning of the end of the Alligator being an on-campus publication.
Well,
Within a year.
President O'Connell put together a plan that traversed beyond my editorship. My editorship went through the spring, and it was the following year. And I think Buddy Davis wrote another editorial. I'm at my job at the Miami Herald, which I had been promised after an internship, not because I broke this law, but because I had won the job during my summer internship. But he wrote another piercing Ronnie Sachs editorial when I was in the Herald newsroom. I remember that one hurt just as bad, but by then I had kind of calloused myself to being hurt by him much more. And I think for Mr. Davis, it was more about the temerity of a student to stand up for the First Amendment when it might get addressed eventually. But put yourself in the head of a 21-year-old college kid during this tumultuous time in the early 70s, and once you find out there's a law that breaks the First Amendment principle, any day it's on the book beyond when I find out about it is a bad day that I could ignore it if I'm serious about journalism. So I actually think that we set an example, the staff of the Alligator, for professionals in the field, that we were willing to take a stand for the First Amendment.
What transpired after this? You went to the Herald on an internship, but you continued to follow the situation closely. What did you see? What did you hear?
What I saw was other editors and staffs, coming after us. They were on the staff at the time this happened, though, having the consequences. And I I did feel bad about that because they had to figure out a way to make this newspaper successful as an independent paper, albeit with some state support, university support with guaranteed advertising for a period of time. Hugh Cunningham, who then was the PR guy for President O'Connell, if he were here today, I would challenge him to this day that it was all a sham intended to be a cover story to give the Alligator independence, when it was really intended that the Alligator would not survive on its own.
Kick it off campus.
Kick it off campus and let the thing die. We can't control it, let it die. That was our feeling at the time. I don't think it's mellowed much in the time. Others have rewritten the history to be that it was intended to give the Alligator survival and independence. I don't believe it.
What did you think at the time? Were you optimistic?
No, really pessimistic. You know, how would this paper survive financially? But just the whole process of moving off campus, the equipment, the business side. There are a lot of heroes and heroines behind the scenes. And I think Debbie Smith was an early editor. I know Randy Bellows, certainly. And I think it was during Debbie's period when, literally, when they had to move into, I think, what was a meat locker behind the College Inn over across campus, they had no typewriters in the very beginning of the transition.
And this is when everything was written on manual typewriters.
Yes, well, we might then, I think we had maybe finally gotten electric, IBM Selectric
Technology.
typewriters. And I remember going to, I believe John Paul Jones was the dean then, and saying, look, isn't there some way, until this can be, the dust can settle, that they could come over and at least use some of our labs in the after hours and do some of the typing. And so I think that's a good example of how informally the college did cooperate and do its part to help the paper. But it was not an easy time, and I think the business staff, I think Ed Barber comes into the picture as the general manager. And I don't, to this day, I don't think the students on the staff understand the sacrifices that come into play with the ad salesman, the circulation people, the business side. Ed Barber for 30 years as general manager, Trish Carey is his successor. It takes a lot to keep what is now a free newspaper solely supported by the advertising revenue to survive. So it's been an interesting, and it continues to evolve. And the thing that I really admire so much about the former editors, starting with Ron, that there is a core support group that lives on in these 40 years that continue to be supportive. We've certainly got a lot of legal help, still free, from Tom Julin, our most recent skirmish with the administration having to do with circulation on our boxes on campus. Has been a good example of how we need our backbone group of support. Ron was right in there helping us get letters of support to the president. Didn't get much success, but our lawsuit that went to federal court did.
I had graduated at the time. I graduated in 1970, and I watched this from St. Petersburg from the Times where I was at the time. How did you feel? We talked about Buddy Davis and his scathing editorials. How did you feel the rest of the media in the state covered the case? Not in terms of support, but how did you think?
Well, we got treated much better by the Los Angeles Times, the Miami Herald, the St. Pete Times, and the Gainesville Sun. I think Mr. Davis asserted himself over the opinion voice there. I think the news columns, the Sun, covered the story pretty fairly, though. I would say again, it was a time when students had no information at all about what was happening in the world if not for the Alligator, which was their primary source of information. Hard to imagine that, but that was actually the case, and we took our job very seriously.
Do you consider yourself a hero?
No, I consider myself a former editor of the Alligator. I think the real heroes in this story are the attorneys who represented us and the staffs that came after us to keep the Alligator alive. I am proud that we did the right thing, and I don't think if we had it to do over again, we would do it any differently, except maybe to raise more money for the legal help.
I noticed the pretty paltry donations there. $20 seemed to be the top end of that.
You could still do that. The statute of limitations.
Yeah, but I do think it's important to note that there were abortion ads in daily newspapers, right along the massage parlor ads on sports pages. The law was routinely being ignored and violated, probably out of ignorance and because it was just a bad law still in the books. And again, we did not intend to break a law or challenge one, but once something we wanted to publish was called into question because of a bad law, we figured let's use all that energy about the First Amendment we're learning about and take this on for a second reason.
And Chuck, you look back on this as with some measure of pride?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That it was a good lawsuit, and sometimes, well, we get beat up a lot, but lawyers are professionals, and we like to be well prepared and do a good job and have a good outcome. And in this case, we were well prepared. We did a good job and had a good outcome. And if you can get all those three, you've earned your right to call yourself a lawyer.
I would ask Chuck one other question, though. I think after Judge Tench's decisions, the state attorney's office, I thought, wanted to appeal. And on appeal, the state intervened on our side of the case, which is why the abortion law ended up getting rewritten. That's how I recall it. Does that jibe with your memory?
Yes, that our local state attorney wanted to appeal. Under our system, the Attorney General, not the Eighth Circuit State Attorney, the Attorney General represents the state of Florida on appeal, and they declined to appeal it.
An old law. So then it all came to pass on February 1st, 1973, 16 months after this decision that the Alligator became independent, and it is independent today. So thank you very much, Ron, for what you did. Thank you, Gene, for your support, and thank you for your worried but concerned help.